Good afternoon, everyone, and happy Friday. Welcome to our second annual ESG conference. We are so excited all of you can make it out today on this beautiful day in College Park. For those of you who I have not had the pleasure of meeting yet, my name is Nima Farshchi, and I'm the director of our Center for Social Value Creation. Here at CSVC, we have a mindset of educating, engaging, and empowering our community to create a better world through business. However it may be, we believe that business is the solution for helping our environmental, social, and governance goals and ensuring that our society is progressing. Throughout the day, you're going to hear from a variety of different speakers. We have an exciting morning keynote, 2 exciting afternoon keynotes, as well as 6 different breakout sessions to learn from one another over the next few hours. And at the end of the day, we hope that you join us from 5 to 6 for a reception to be able to network and understand each other's goals, ambitions, and how we can partner to achieve our society's greatest grand challenges of our time. One thing that's different about this year's conference is our launch of our State of Impact report focused on environmental and social value creation. Over the past 6 months, the Center for Social Value Creation has done research on over 150 reports through about over 100 Fortune 500 companies across 9 different industries. This report is the overarching aggregate of all reports, but we have industry-specific reports available on our website, which you can find by scanning the QR code that's either on your program, in the hallway, or at the poster sessions. All 9 of these reports are being launched throughout the day and will be publicly available to showcase how different industries tackle the grand challenges of our time, whether it be environmental or social, how we define it, what the strategies are to tackle these problems, how the funding occurs for it, and what the best practices are for companies who are passionate about environmental and social value creation to move forward. We really hope that you look at this report, take it into thought, whether you're a student, an alumni, or a corporate leader, how this work can help enhance the work that you are doing here today. To set the stage for this report and the work we're doing, I would love to welcome Carolyn Berkowitz as our morning keynote. Carolyn is the leader of the Association of Corporate Citizenship Professionals. She joined as our president and CEO as of July 2018. She is nationally recognized as a corporate social impact leader who has guided nonprofits, foundations, and Fortune 500 companies to solve complex social issues and realize their greatest impact. Under her leadership, ACCP has grown its corporate membership by 20% and introduced new programs, research, and partnerships for corporate citizenship professionals on topics including racial equity, ESG, and benchmarking. Carolyn was twice named among the 100 most influential business leaders in Washington, D.C. by the Washington Business Journal, earned the Washington Area Women's Foundation's Visionary Award, and was appointed by Governor Terry McAuliffe to serve 2 terms on the Virginia Community College Board. She received her BA in psychology from GW, and we are so excited for her to join us here today and share more about the amazing work at ACCP, but give us a practical understanding of how ESG is across industries. So I welcome Carolyn to the stage.
That's good. Great. Better with light? Okay, great. Good afternoon, everybody. It is a pleasure for me to be here. I'm especially grateful to you, Nima, and to Julia, who has done just yeoman's work in putting this conference together. So thank you for inviting me. I'm honored to be here, and I'm honored to do the job of providing you with a broad overview of each of the pieces that you'll hear much, much more about as you go through your afternoon, and also that you'll read more about in the center's wonderful report. So I'm done with this. Have one? Oh no, I've got it. Good.
Right now.
Yeah, okay. So you heard a little bit about ACCP. We are a trade association that exists to provide practitioners in the field of corporate responsibility with the tools and resources and community that they need to make more effective change inside their companies and outside in the community and with society. And we have approximately, and it changes regularly, but we work with approximately 245 companies, mostly Fortune, I'd say 300 companies, but certainly not exclusively. Companies of all sizes are doing this work now. We also have an interesting history, and a history that mirrors that which I'll talk about today, which is the evolution from CSR, from philanthropy actually, to CSR to ESG. So we were founded in 2005 by a group of 15 companies who came together to say corporate philanthropy is a real profession and it requires, a serious body of knowledge. It's not the aloha suite for long-term executives who now want to do something nice at the end of their career, which it was for a long time. So they came together and professionalized the field, created a body of knowledge around what it is that companies needed to know and the practitioners in them to make this more strategic function. And so we grew in size and scope over the years, and the whole way it was always about connecting the business and the business strategy with the social strategy, so that the returns continue to be valuable. Because as we know, if there are not returns other than it feels good to do, a business that exists in part, well, it used to be for its shareholders, and now it's for its stakeholders more broadly, does not have its own license to operate. It doesn't have a reason to be if it is not considering the value that it provides. So as we get, work into incorporating broader practice areas, the association changed in that way too. And so now we are a broad group of 245 companies. We've got approximately 2,000 leaders in our midst. We represent all of the disciplines that you would connect with the S and the E, not as much with the G, but in some cases also with the G. And so ESG, CSR, DEI, corporate foundations, all of those things. So we're going to talk a little bit today about the context for the work, the purpose and the difference between purpose and ESG and CSR. I'll tell you a little bit about the history and the evolution, the importance and the trends, and of course the challenges that we're all facing right now. And then I will be a bridge into the conversation about University of Maryland State of Impact Report. So I'll start by setting the context that there are three intersecting but separate disciplines. So you could look at this two ways. You could say that there's purpose, there's CSR, and there's ESG, and they overlap. You could say that there's a pyramid with purpose at the bottom, ESG in the middle, and CSR at the top. And that's when they're really aligned. Or you could say that it's almost like a bullseye. There's, purpose is the widest and CSR is the narrowest, and they all fit within the circle. It really depends sort of how your company approaches it. But this I know, that they are overlapping at least and intersecting, and that there is important leverage to be gained from each of them when they are connected and working together. So I'm going to start by parsing them out and unpacking a little bit and talk about what purpose is. So purpose is the big picture for a company. It's the why of a company. We exist to do X. ESG and CSR can be expressions of that purpose, but they are not the reason why a company exists. So when we think about an authentic and motivating basis for alignment among all of the stakeholders that is central to the success of the business, that's what we're talking about with purpose. There are three different kinds of purpose. They are not always as clean cut as I will describe in these three companies that I'll share a little bit more about, but your company can have a purpose that is cause-based. So I'll look at Beyond Meat. And let me get to Beyond Meat's stated purpose. So Beyond Meat says their purpose is a better way to feed our future. And so you can see that the world would be worse off without Beyond Meat in their view. And that's what makes it cause-based. So the cause is the environment will be better, people will be healthier, it'll be a better world for animals, whatever those things are, in essence, it is doing this thing, replacing meat with plant-based foods is our cause and why we exist. You go to a company like Capital One, which is my former employer, and I know a very proud supporter of both the Smith School and the university writ large. It's a competency-based purpose. And so Capital One's purpose is banking for good, helping our customers succeed by bringing ingenuity, simplicity, and humanity to banking. So the product, what they are good at, the way they sell their product, the way their product works in the marketplace, those things are noble. It is certainly not the entire business that is about each of those things, but regardless of whether it is their commercial real estate business or their community development housing lending business, all of those things are more human, more simple, bring ingenuity. And so that's what competency-based looks like. If you look at a company like Zappos, it's culture-based. And culture-based is all about the way the company operates as delivering goodness. It's not necessarily what it makes, or sells, it's not about the shoes themselves. And it's not about, how the shoes do good in any way. It is about their culture of their purpose is live and deliver wow. And so what they're saying is we have a purpose, and it is to have the greatest customer service in the world. And so purpose is neither ESG nor CSR. One of the things that I find really interesting, and I will tell you a little bit about an experience that I had just this year. I did some work for an aerospace manufacturing company, one of the very largest ones that is resident in the Washington area. And I was on the review panel for their ESG report. And so they have a panel of experts from all these disciplines that come in and not only help them shape the report a little bit or give them feedback on the report, but also give them feedback on their strategy in each of those areas. And so they declared at that meeting and in their report that their purpose was environmental and that they were all about carbon emissions and waste. Well, they can't. An aerospace company cannot have as its purpose the environment. It just is not a purpose. It is clearly part of what they do. They're very dedicated to ESG. They want to do that work very differently, but they use the word wrong. And so you'll see that a lot. There's a lot of sort of interchanging of the word, but it means really very different things. So what's ESG? I'm gonna guess that most of you know that, that's why you're here. But I really like the definition that it's a framework, criteria, and a set of standards for the actions a company takes that manages stakeholders, evaluates risk, and increases value. So it has a lot of jobs. It's a lot of different things that has a lot of different jobs within a company. There is also a monetization and a financial piece of it, which does not exist necessarily in some of the other disciplines that are closely related to it. So you can see that the E is really looking at the impact of resource consumption on the environment that a business makes and how the company performs as a steward of nature. The S is how business interacts socially, how business interacts with the relationships that it sustains with all of its stakeholders, with employees, suppliers, communities where the company lives, works, exists. And the G part is looking at leadership, internal practices, processes, policies, sort of how the work gets done, how decisions get made, and how those things impact, the E and the S ultimately. The G is interesting also because it is not just governance of ESG, which is embedded in that, but it's governance of the company, period. So if we look at each of the different components of ESG, you can see that there's a long laundry list of things within each. This is not comprehensive. This was done probably a year ago. You could probably, if you look at the people in this room that are doing work on specific things, they may in fact say, I don't see myself in here, I don't see my work in here. These are probably the most, the broadest and sort of most recognized set of things. But what you see in the environment is the specific environmental issues and how the company conducts itself within those specific issues. In the S part, you see the specific sets of relationships there and how the company engages within those sets of relationships. And in governance, you see the specific set of systems or policies or processes and how the company interacts or conducts itself within those. The last thing I'll say about the scope is that it's not always clean. So you take something like environmental justice, which sits theoretically in S, I don't know, it could sit in E, but you start to see that they overlap. And so what I've decided, and you can take it from me or you can decide yourself, is that the categorization matters a whole lot less than the intent of the work you do and the impact of the work you do in any of the dimensions. And so, it matters maybe in the report where you put it, but there's a trick question always about, well, where does board diversity sit? Well, board diversity sits in governance because it's the board of directors. Diversity sits in social because it is about relationships with people. And so, they're all trick questions in these things. And once we get into it, we realize that none of it is particularly simple and that there are lots of opportunities for intersect among them. So in the last piece of unpacking, I'll go to CSR. So probably the simplest definition is CSR is a company's role in and responsibility towards society. That could be, anything that I've already said in some ways. It's the sense of responsibility towards the community and the environment in which it works. And the third definition is it's a business model, which is interesting because not everybody calls it a business model. It's a business model by which companies make a concerted effort to operate in ways that enhance rather than detract from communities. I come from the banking world. The bank that I work for purchased a huge online bank during the time that I was there and leading this effort. And we had hearings all around the country, the first hearings after the Dodd-Frank Act, where we had to actually defend and we had to bring in testifiers that would defend that actually a community is better off having us there than not having us there because of all of the things that we bring to society by being a part of that community. So it's really about the idea if you're a +1, you're not a -1 in community. So I like to look at this to the right there on what's in a name. And you hear this called something different everywhere you go. So it's corporate social impact, it's corporate social responsibility, it's corporate responsibility, it's the foundation. My eyes are bad, so I can't read that far, but you name it, there's just all these different titles for that work. And it doesn't matter either what the title is. It does matter to people in the field. So they call us all the time and say, like, really, you've got to solve this because I don't know what to call myself. I don't know what to call it. And what I always tell them is call it whatever your company calls it, because that's, you can tell by the name sort of what they're most interested in. When it's corporate social impact, that's what they're interested in. They're interested in the impact. When it's responsibility, they want to say, we're good corporate citizens. So it's sort of, you have to listen and understand the culture. I wouldn't fight over a name. The one thing I would say, and this is, it's almost dangerous, is that people say that CSR is dying, CSR is dead, CSR now is ESG. Like, CSR isn't dying and CSR isn't dead. What they really want to say is CSR is becoming more and more and more strategic. And the only way that it continues to be funded and appreciated and valuable and impactful is when it is strategic and aligned with the business. It doesn't mean it's dead. So what I've also decided, and you could agree or not agree, is that at best, it's sort of lazy and headline grabbing to say CSR is dead. And I think at worst, it really limits the ability to have impact. It limits the funding for the function, and you know, you get a CEO that doesn't really understand much about it, who says CSR is dead. Oh, I'm sorry, CSR is dead here. And so I think you know, it's difficult to use a few words in the media, in your own company, but we've got to figure out a way to talk about ourselves that doesn't kill the function, because the name, you know, may be changing as, you know, as we learn new things about the environment and society. So I'll start by taking you through a bit of a journey here on sort of what's the history. Julia asked me to talk about how did we get from CSR to ESG? Well, what I'd say is we only need to go to the bottom two boxes of the 10s and 20s to tell you that part. But the practice started in the late 1800s. You take guys like Carnegie's and Rockefeller's, wealthy business people who said, we're going to use the profits from our business, my take-home pay from the business, to support society. And I'm going to tell my other business friends that they need to do the same thing. And so, you know, you go to cities like Pittsburgh and everything has the word Carnegie on it. And that's from that old practice of way back when. We fast forward 50 years, and there is an economist named Howard Bowen. Bowen, is that what it says? Can't read it again. So there's an economist named Howard Bowen, who was also the president of Grinnell University, who published a book called Social Responsibilities of the Businessman. Yes, that's what it's called. And he makes a case that says that business has a responsibility to society in this textbook. So in some ways, he's sort of considered the first academic father of the movement. In the 70s, the Committee for Economic Development puts out a statement that says that there's a social contract between business and society, and that to operate inside of a community, you need to make a commitment to society. And the commitment is specifically around, you need to improve the economy, you need to pay your workers well, and you need to make the community a better place. And so that started, it wasn't quite regulatory, but it was definitely sort of a public admonition. When we go to the 80s, which is, no, it's not quite when I got on the field, maybe another decade, but we come to Archie Carroll, who is also a professor, and you see more, if you look this stuff up in the literature, that's where you start to see the definition of CSR from this guy, Archie Carroll, who's still alive and well, and a grand capitalist who's on, you know, can follow him as I do. But he created this pyramid that said that the responsibilities of a company are first economic, then they're legal, then they're ethical, and then they're philanthropic. And that's what he called sort of corporate social responsibility. We move along into the 90s, and now we're sort of starting to feel it a little bit more, and it's much more regular. George H.W. Bush declares 1,000 points of light, and what he meant was anywhere in America, somebody, including some corporation or set of employees, are solving a problem that we can all replicate. And so he highlighted the work of regular people and companies and employees, and that was a way of encouraging others to do that. It was also sort of his talking about volunteerism started a bigger wave of corporate volunteerism, moving away from just the community chest kind of thing where employees gave to the United Way and started now moving into the company using more of its stuff to solve social problems. But I will say that there was no hook in it. So it was just about that there was no hook that made anybody do it. There was just the holding it up and shining the spotlight on the work. In the 2000s, we start to see, as administrations change and politics change, it is a way of getting away from regulations, et cetera. We start to see organizations pop up and movements where corporations are asked to make commitments. So if you think of the Clinton Global Initiative or America's Promise, those were both places where company publicly committed to doing this work around this issue, and the public accountability was the hook. So we publish a report every year that says, here are the companies, here's what they said they were going to do, they did this. It was still a glow and a halo of it, but it is how companies worked. We moved from philanthropy, or the word corporate philanthropy, to becoming much more often called CSR. And in the 2010s is when it really sort of hyped up considerably. So that's when ESG really started. That's when it was talked about much more. That's when State Street and other investors started putting pressure on companies. So State Street was the first one that said that we will either divest or not recommend investing in companies that don't have women on their boards. Well, that was like, whoa, that was a big thing. And State Street then, of course, in 2017 commissions the woman standing on, the girl on Wall Street. And so you had companies responding that way to Exxon, for example. The UN SDGs were at their 15-year mark, so there were 15 more years to get to 2030. So you started to see that that really ramp up. And at the end of the 2010s and into the 2020s, and it's kind of crazy because it's only 2022 as I say this, it sort of all blew open. So in 2020 is the year that it was the Davos Manifesto about business and society. It was the year that Larry Fink changed and really put ESG issues into his letter to both CEOs and investors. It was the SDGs as a real measure of the things that these other business people were talking about. It was when a bunch of the rankings and ratings, et cetera, really started. And oh, by the way, there was a global pandemic and a racial reckoning that really changed the views on S, I would say, dramatically. And so here we are sort of only 2 years into it. And I would say, you look at the 2020s, and I have no idea what we'll say in 2030 about this decade, given that we're only 2 years into it. So I'll go back to ESG a little bit, and we'll talk about what's really important about it. So there are all kinds of benefits coming from this, and you'll hear this from other speakers today. But there's this enormous stakeholder pressure for transparency and accountability. People want to know what a company is doing. They want to be able to see it. They want to hold them accountable. We know that there's regulatory and disclosure requirements in different places, and we all have to meet them. And so this helps us to meet them. There's risk mitigation and reduction. So the risk mitigation and reduction is in a whole variety of ways. If you go macro, risk mitigation and reduction is around, how the environment, very specifically, how global warming affects our ability to produce products and services, et cetera. You then start to think about how the stock price is impacted, and risk, they have shown, is much more manageable, and companies are considered much more stable when they have a solid ESG portfolio or record, because they are doing things that account for a variety of risks. And so it is less of a financial risk when a company is invested and working across an ESG. Obviously, there is enhancing the financial performance of a company. So it's a little bit muddy right now, I will say, on that. And there are people in this room that probably know more about this than I do. But the picture is a little bit less clear in the current economic situation with inflation and with headwinds the way they are. And so the stocks are not necessarily quite outperforming other stocks. I don't necessarily know that they are worse, but they are not quite on the same trajectory or better over the long term. And so what I think CEOs know is that the long-term trajectory is to stay on course, because this matters financially. When times get tough, they don't always behave that way. And so I would say it's an interesting time to watch that financial performance. There is improved brand and reputation. So, you think about buyers, et cetera, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Companies are appreciated when they do good. Being a good corporate citizen, attracting and retaining top talent is huge. It's probably, on a daily basis, one of the most important reasons why companies are engaged in this work, because to keep their people and to attract good people, they need to be both environmentally and socially conscious companies. And then finally, there's this harnessing of innovation. So, when does innovation arrive? When you've got the toughest problems to solve. One of the reasons why I got into this was because I said to myself, I want to both do social good and make money. So what's the innovation that's in there? It's that same mindset, is that when talented people are solving complex problems, cool stuff comes out of it. And so you can see, and you'll see from lots of others, when I was looking at other people's decks, there might even be some of the same data in here. But, the bottom line importance, there's top line growth. 75% of millennials are willing to pay more for an environmentally sustainable product. 92% of US investors agree that a company with strong ESG performance deserves a premium valuation in its stock price. 71% of employees would be more likely to accept a job offer from a company that they believe to be socially responsible. And 76% of consumers would discontinue their relationship with a company or product if they knew that it treated the environment, employees, or communities where they operate poorly. Those are some staggering numbers, and you could keep on looking. There's more and more stuff that looks just like this that comes out every year. So what are the trends that we're all experiencing right now in our companies? And I do kind of want to stop and ask, for the people in this room, if you work at a company, would you raise your hand? And if you are a student, would you raise your hand? Okay, so there's more company people, so you all can sort of nod or not nod. So the trends that we are seeing right now is the three priority issues, and a lot of this actually comes from a report that just came out like last week, the week before, very, very recently, from Morningstar Sustainalytics. They surveyed, several hundred people in the field, and the issues are carbon, and sort of a future issue is the scope 3 carbon emissions, human capital, which is employees in every way, retaining them, paying them, DEI, all of those things, and human rights in terms of the countries in which it operates, human rights in terms of its supply chain. And so those are the things that, that companies are thinking about. When I say scope 3, very specifically, 89% or 90%, I think, I have it in here. It doesn't matter, most. Percent of companies are focusing on scope 1, absolutely, of their emissions. Like, we have to pollute less in what we do. And scope 2, which is what we buy, has to be more environmentally friendly. Scope 3, and what we buy, specifically things like energy. So what we buy and use. And scope 3 is sort of all of the indirect things, the way our suppliers conduct themselves, our business travel, you know, how all of the different things that we do contribute to damaging the world and to carbon. And so there's real pressure, public pressure and otherwise, to start thinking about and talking about scope 3, but they're not doing it as much. And people who are inside are worried about that. Like, I've got to count this. I've got to report on this. I'm going to have to be held accountable for this one day. But it's just not sort of as immediate. So I think our folks are starting to worry about that an awful lot. So the next trend is about much more rigorous data collection and using the various frameworks that there are. There are lots of them. GRI, TCFD, SASB, MSCI, you name it, they're all different ways to report out on the work. So the two that Morningstar says are the most popular right now are GRI and TCFD. TCFD is 100% environmental, whereas the others incorporate other things. So you can see that 66% are using GRI, 51% are using TCFD. Those add up to more than 100. That's because most companies that are doing this work are doing 2 or more. There are increased investments in reporting and in tech and in and FTEs that do the reporting and the analysis of all of, you know, the data collection and the reporting. So I just read from Deloitte, 99% of Fortune 100 companies say that they are investing more in reporting technology and tools. That's a lot if you're manufacturing, I mean, if you're in the business of creating technology and tools for ESG reporting. The emerging regulatory environment, the SEC climate disclosure, you know, there's all kinds of complications, but it's basically, the idea is that disclosing will no longer be voluntary, that it will be required. And there's lots of you know, different regs for different size companies, et cetera, but it's complicated and it's coming. The EU's non-financial reporting directive, and then you have these state regulations like the state of California with regulations about board and women on boards and people of color on boards, et cetera. There are a whole variety of states that have these different regulations that that we're all needing to pay attention to. Investors' expectations are changing. So, you know, the idea of greenwashing, they're looking much more carefully at that. Ratings and rankings, the rating and ranking matters to investors, and the level of risk that your company is taking by engaging or not engaging in this work is also something that investors are clearly taking a look at. The internal structure and collaboration is complicated. So, so the trend is that the work is embedded all the way across the organization. Today I sat at lunch and it was the greatest thing. I sat at lunch at a table where we had a finance person, we had a marketing person, we had a green energy manufacturing person. There were just so many different dimensions of the work that we were all sitting around and talking about, an expert in. And so it is happening in every pocket of the company. The challenging piece is centrally managing it so that it is one story, one effort, one initiative, one report, one set of compliance issues. But it requires this collaboration and alignment across. And so that's a trend. And then there's the political crossfire right now, and cultural divisiveness that we are seeing, CSG woke, you read in the paper. Is Texas now saying that banks have to lend to gun manufacturers whether they want to or not? So it's mucky there, and in terms of trends, we're not only having to deal with it, but we're needing to think about how to communicate to all of these stakeholders in this funky time. ESG and CSR specifically, it's a great day for the two of those areas to be working really closely. So if you look at ESG on the left, and they're really good at materiality and a materiality assessment, which is the factors that are most important to the success of your business. And they understand through the various reportings about the transparency requirements and how to do that and how to report with their facts and figures and not necessarily with stories. If you look at the work of CSR and the list of things in its circle, it brings to the table internal collaboration, because we've been doing that forever. It's the only way we've had to do it for survival, whereas other lines don't necessarily have to do that for survival. When I worked at Capital One, I knew every executive in the company, and these people in different lines of business, no idea who the others were. So we've been sort of pulling that table together for forever. And then we're really good at measuring the impact, or at least we're further along on measuring the impact. So not just the output, but the impact. And so those sort of four things around the various functions together make it an ideal opportunity for really good and strong collaboration. So from a practical perspective, what do people like me or others of you that are working in ESG specifically, what's the challenge in executing it? Structural, technical, and strategic. So budget constraints was number one. 89% of folks said that their biggest problem was the budget. They don't have the funding to do this work and do it well, both in terms of, the external work that is required in making E and the S and the G happen, and in the work in pulling it together, reporting on it, et cetera, managing it. Same thing with lack of human resources, and there's a real lack of internal expertise. So for students, it is the time to go into ESG. I am telling you, they are hiring like mad on something that is really, really important and requires expertise. So it's a good time for that. Technically, measuring and reporting is complicated. You don't know which report to do. There's a lot of data to collect. It's a big tax on the business lines to collect it. The mandatory disclosures versus the voluntary disclosures, it's always preferable to disclose voluntarily. If you do, you can only hope then that there won't be as many mandates, or at least that's the reasoning of business. But the pendulum shifts, and it shifts with administrations, and it shifts as problems become more and more complex. And then meeting those regulations and compliance. And then strategically setting goals and targets is challenging. What's important? What's ambitious enough? A bunch of companies aren't, for example, setting scope 3 targets yet. And so, how do they do that? How do they align across areas on what it is that these targets will be and that they can live up to? Leadership buy-in is really complex. It's really, really complex. So I saw a survey that said that CFOs don't buy it. And so even though stocks are performing better, and even though the CEO says so, and even though the government affairs people are saying so, it's not quite sinking in a way. And so the same people will say, like something like 75% of CEOs said, yes, this helps our long-term valuation and finances. And 57% said, but the first thing I'm going to cut as I'm coming into this era is in ESG work. And so it's kind of like, you know, it's really, it's tough. And then, of course, there's this unstable external environment that we talked about where there's these factions and become very red and blue. The kinds of problems that are emerging are more complex and more difficult. You don't know when something happens. Like if you think about the murder of George Floyd and how that, you know, sort of came on the national scene with literally a bang. And you don't, there's very little predicting how these things will change, and yet companies need to be ready to respond to them. In terms of sort of the macro and what we need to do, how am I on time? Am I good? Okay, great. So there, measurement is a macro issue. There isn't really standardized measurement. People all are saying which one and why. The S is not monetized. So the E is monetized and the G is monetized. The S is not yet really monetized well. You can still be a pretty bad actor and as a company, and you know, will look good on the S reporting requirements. And so I think until we have an exchange for sort of the cost of social issues and the cost of social problems and how business solving them starts to make a difference economically for the business, it's going to be really hard to do that. And so I think you'll hear inside there's a lot of what do we measure and how do we prove it. So I think the S being monetized is important because if you look just at 2020 and you look at the pandemic or you look at the racial reckoning, those are both huge S issues, but they can't quite be measured and monetized. And then there's this broadening focus. So, you know, it's not only the things in ESG, but why we're doing it for all these different reasons makes measuring it really difficult. Are you measuring the impact or are you measuring, you know, the output? And so, you know, I would say in ESG, there's less impact measurement than in CSR or in some other places. Then we move over to governance and management. I think probably the most interesting here that is a macro risk is the executive comp tied to ESG goals. And that is more and more common. And then if you look at the changing world, we've already talked about stakeholder capitalism and the polarization, et cetera. And so how these things resolve themselves will be interesting. So it gets me to what you all have released today, which is really, really exciting. And I'll just start by saying, when we were talking about what's in a name or why names are challenging, environmental and social value creation is the perfect name. So it really, really describes what it is in a way that none of these other names seem to have done. And so what you all here in the center have defined as ESVC is this range of action and initiatives that seeks to both benefit the bottom line and the world. And I think that is a really beautiful description of it. So there's 6 ways that through this report, we can drive impact. And I think you probably hear each of those things and some of the things that I've said. One of them is product research, development, and innovation. One of them is in sustainable production and how you actually do that work. One of them is in managing the supply chain and procuring and having that be much more socially conscious. One of them is in coalition building and starting to partner with others who care about the same issues, who are doing the same things, who are learning from one another. One of them is about financial and in-kind support. So So, funding these things is awkward at best and difficult. It comes from a lot of different places, but how companies, support and provide resources to these initiatives matters. And then, the last one is talent management, which, you could see in all the statistics about what employees want and how to work with them that matters here. So the report goes on to talk about a set of recommendations, and there are 4 things. There's a world of knowledge that goes into each one of them. But I hope that from what we've talked about, you can see some of that. So the first is to identify the levers that best fit your business. So, there's the set of assets that you have as a business, there's the business that you're in, there are the things that you want to achieve, and that will help you drive, in essence, your targets. Instituting operational oversight. So how is it managed and how is it governed? And how does perhaps a centralized organization that collects this help all the way across the institution in doing its work? Employ a hybrid financing model that incorporates funding into the overall objective and then funds separately this centralized specific department or initiative. So every single unit needs to be in ways paying its way towards this because it fits inside the work that all of the lines of business and functions are doing. And there is also this idea that it needs to be funded from the center. And so that's, you're never going to get it all the way in the center. And you're never going to get it all the way out in business, but you've got to do both in order for it to be funded to the level you need. And then consider all of the transparent and disclosure kind of reporting that you need to do. Figure out which one fits best for you, who you're speaking to, which audience, what you're trying to communicate, and implement a transparent and holistic reporting system. So thank you. You can see there's my email address and our website, and we've got some interesting things to download. And if we have time, we can take questions, and if we don't,
I think time for a couple questions too. Yeah.
great. 1 and then 2.
Hello, I have a specific interest more in the dynamics of ESG and social considerations in commerce and business.
In
The dynamics,
the
meaning
dynamics where
in economics and commerce and business.
yeah.
One thing that wasn't specifically, another sort of constructive criticism that wasn't presented, that government itself, the federal government, is part of our big social environment, and that wasn't really specified at all there. Yes, we do talk about corporations, but larger organizations such as government, federal government, state government are very important. Universities also are a organization. How do they fit into such categories? And specifically, from a dynamic viewpoint, how can you not only describe the problem, meaning describe inequities and how they might be addressed, but predict what you can do and what specific actions will lead to what results, meaning cause and effect. What cause and effect predictions are available in your theories?
Lot there. So I'll start with the latter and say that centers like yours are actually starting to look at very specifically the cause and effect and those things as more and more universities and scholarly journals, et cetera, come out with or adopt this and consider a field of study in and of itself. You'll see more of that as well. I think more businesses are partnering with universities, not just to recruit, it used to be just about recruiting. Now they're really partnering with universities to create new knowledge that because the company can't create it on its feet when it is changing that quickly and the requirements are changing that quickly. And so I think, I think companies are having very different relationships with universities other think tanks than they had even 2 years ago. The relationship with government is complex and unique. There are, we start with lobbying, and we'll say that most companies aren't doing loud lobbying, but are not wild about having mandatory disclosures. And so, I think there's always shifts as administrations change. And you can see that it goes back and forth and that you lose, 2 years of ground in one direction or another. The juice is at the state level right now, and there is a lot that is happening at the state level around these issues. So, if you just look at the different kinds of rules and regulations and legislation that's coming down in red states and blue states, and in the anti-ESG lobbying that is going on in Florida. If you look at what happened with Disney, where it's not only about laws, but it's also about the state government divesting of its funds in Disney. And so there's all kinds of stuff happening with government. Government is also not particularly trusted right now in this country. I know you didn't know that, but government is not very trusted. Our employers are much more trusted. So that's an interesting thing too. So there's an ecosystem that is much broader that impacts all of these things, but sort of the overview inside a company is what I wanted to focus most on. Oh, and the dynamics. The dynamics are changing between businesses and communities. Businesses know they have to listen differently in community. Businesses can't come in now and say, I'll fix this for you. You have to do it our way. We know how to do things. You people in communities don't. That is widely rejected right now. And so you see activist communities. You also see partnering, valuing lived experience, different. It will continue to change. I hope it changes, but you can see real examples, trust-based philanthropy that a lot of companies are now starting to adopt, at least in part for their foundations. You could see that dynamic starting to change. Yes.
Thank you, Carolyn. This was fantastic. I'm Kisa. Love your historical viewpoint around through the ages. My question is about balancing the characters of the senior leadership with the good the company does. You mentioned Andrew Carnegie. He has his name on a lot of things. However, he violently squashed a strike during his company.
Ford, you name it.
Exactly. And so you have these companies, I'm going to name him because he's dead, I'm not going to name the current ones, but
Right.
you see these companies where the leaders are doing things that run counter to
Yes.
the social contract or just aren't doing well in terms of the court of public opinion, but their companies are doing phenomenal things. So how do we engage the public when we have these two different narratives, the one of the good company and the one of the leader that leaves a little to be to move forward and room for improvement?
Great question. I don't know what anybody thinks of Jamie Dimon. I don't know what I think of Jamie Dimon. I'll start right there. Jamie Dimon told CNBC just the other day in Squawk Box that when there was all this argument back about ESG and you shouldn't be doing ESG and you need to do something else, what he said is, what, you don't want me to hire veterans then? Fine, I won't hire veterans. So it's like, bad actors are bad actors. People are flawed. I think there is more and more accountability that the public is holding executives to. And you see people, high profile people losing jobs. You also see history, looking backwards and names being taken off a lot of things. So I don't have a crystal ball about that. I do think that there's more and more accountability in the system right now, and whether that is regulatory or whether that is social media, there's more public accountability, and so can't get away quite with the committee. One more or no? 2 more? How many more?
One more.
One more. Thank you for picking stuff.
I really appreciate your comment about CFOs and the internal challenges that are happening. And in my own company, I'm struggling because CFOs are very data driven.
Yeah.
I'm more social impact driven. And to marry the two is becoming very difficult. What it does is it causes internal confusion and it skews what is ESG really about. And it'd be great to hear some examples of how maybe some companies are really balancing this CFO and the data-driven people versus the social impact people. Because I find that the biggest weakness of ESG is because it is so data-driven that any data can be skewed to make the narrative that you want. And the social impact people are really about the actual impact of the work that you're doing. Are there any companies that you see that have a good balance in this? Because I struggle with this.
So, you know, in some ways, that's the CSR ESG rub. And I think one is a narrative, and I think one is about more transparent reporting and financial returns sort of at the heart. And one is more about the story and the people and the outcomes and the long-term impact on humans and who you hire as a result of your training, you know, and how people feel about working for your company. So I don't want to say that this company does it well or this company doesn't do it well. I would say big companies have a better opportunity because they're a big elephant, and so you could, you know, there's all sides of the elephant that you can sort of touch, rather than a small company where you can sort of see the whole thing all the time. But Bank of America, for example, has one of the more sophisticated ESG approaches and has a really great reputation in terms of ESG in its financial models and its financial sort of side and regulatory side. And yet they have an amazing foundation with a bundle of money doing fantastic work that connects to directly back to their business, whether it is supporting the development of affordable housing, whether it is, you know, supporting small businesses that are growing and that people of color specifically are entrepreneurs and funding that set of entrepreneurs very exclusively. They're doing great work in terms of their own hiring and their own employee relations with that. And so I think the sheer size of them and their business, you know, what they do makes them kind of really good at both. And they do talk about it in some, like, they'll come to our stage and talk about it together because that's the way we view the world. They also know very well that when they go to this part of the world, they talk about this, and when they go to that part of the world, they talk about that. So you don't hear them talking about it at their investors conference so much. They're talking about the numbers, and you don't hear them talking about it, about the numbers as much with their employees or in their recruiting or even, you know, in the work they do in community and how they pull community together. You don't hear them talking about the numbers because the people in community will say, you're just doing it for the numbers. So it's sort of, you know, and we even had an executive come to one of our things and say, we call our ESG report ESG. We don't call our efforts ESG because there's too much criticism about that. And, you know, they said, just do the work. Don't call it anything. You know, like just do the good.